Hello and welcome back to Joe Baylor Revision. Today we're going to be looking at the making of America 1789 to 1900, especially the first part, which is America's expansion from 1789 to 1838. So let's start. So the Declaration of Independence was signed in 1776, and it's when the United States was first recognized as a country. And at this time, all of the original 13 colonies, which were the original 13 states, were owned. This included Virginia, New York, North and South Carolina, Pennsylvania, and Maryland, and these were all on the East Coast, as that's when settlers first arrived, the first permanent settlement being in Jamestown in Virginia, founded by English settlers in 1607. So, of course, over time, it expanded, it grew, so they introduced new states into the United States. So Ohio became a state in 1803, Kentucky in 1792, and Louisiana in 1812. Louisiana is important because it took part in the Louisiana Purchase. A lot of land that was west of the Mississippi River was bought by America for $15 million from France in 1803. And although this seems like a lot of money, it was bought for less than 3 cents per acre of land, so they didn't have to pay that much for it. Yeah. And some of the land that was taken in this time was Arkansas and Missouri, which was because this became states after the Louisiana Purchase. Because the purchase took place, they were allowed to take that land. It gained valuable land for settling Americans, but it also opened trade routes, as the port of New Orleans was in Louisiana, and this would become the place where a third of all goods were transported into and out of the United States of America, so it was very important for their growth over time in the future. So next, let's look at expanding westwards. So the Lewis and Clark expedition took place from 1804 to 1806. And this was where the two men, Lewis and Clark, reached the west coast, and they explored new lands, mapping and documenting discoveries. And this would obviously have an impact on the future, as it would make maps for the people to go and do the same and travel there. They worked with Indians such as Sacagawea, who was their guide, but also fought them, such as Black Bull, who was a Sioux leader. So next, Thomas Jefferson thought that the ideal American should own land, because then they'd own a stake in their country and they'd have stuff to lose, so they'd vote properly. So he wanted all these Americans to have land, particularly be farmers, like yeoman farmers. He thought that was a good idea. So because of his beliefs, land was sold in the Northwest and Southwest territories. So to people, 640 acres was sold for $640. But not everyone could buy this, so land speculators bought the money from the government and then sold it to other ordinary Americans in smaller amounts so they could actually afford it. So these big companies came in and bought up a load of the land and then sold it to the smaller people for higher amounts per acre, but they wouldn't have to pay as much because they'd only buy a few acres. So people would move there, and that would lead to the creation of many new states because they were traveling west. As soon as an area becomes settled by so many people, it will become a state eventually. So next, let's look at early interactions with Native Americans. So tribes in lands northwest of the colonies supported the British in the War of Independence, because the British promised to them, we will not expand our colonies onto Indian land. And however, the British lost in 1783 in the war and had to sign a treaty which gave over 230 million acres of Indian land to the US. And the Indians disagreed with that because they thought they have no right to do that, that's our land, not the British land, but the British still signed over as that was agreed on the treaty. So because of this, settlers started moving into the Northwest and Southwest territories, as they thought, you know what, it's okay, this land belongs to us now because the British have given it to us because of the war. And along that land, frontiersmen set up farms on the Indian land. That led to a lot of conflict. And the government didn't help with fighting Native Americans at this time. They didn't send the US Army in, so the frontiersmen often faced them themselves with their guns and weapons like that, which they couldn't compete against very well. George Washington was the first president, and he became president in 1789. And he saw the Indians as a big threat to the American way of life and how things were going on. So 80% of government funds were used on a campaign against the Indians. So he spent a lot of money on trying to get rid of them. We can see this happening here with the Battle of Fallen Timbers. It took place in the Northwest Territory, and the US Army was sent out to defeat the Indians. And this led to a treaty being signed, the Treaty of Greenville of 1795. And this said that the Indians had to move west as their land was lost, which would lead to more conflict between tribes, as where they would be spread out before, they would all have to live close together now, which they weren't used to. And also, Indians had to give over vast amounts of land to the US. So the American settlers thought they'd already taken all the land because of the War of Independence, but then they fought the Indians and came to an agreement that they would actually take it now from them. So next, let's look at the removal of Indians in the East. So Indian tribes in Southeast America adapted to try and fit into the US. So an example of this would be the Cherokee tribe. They created a government and economy based on the US. They created an alphabet. They also built a capital city called Echota, which would make them more like the Americans settlers. President Andrew Jackson still didn't see the Indians as civilized, and he thought that they were really bad. So he said, "What good man would prefer a country covered with forest and ranged by a few thousand savages?" So he was pretty aggressive towards them. He wanted to get rid of them. So he ignored a Supreme Court ruling that protected Cherokee land. So he didn't care what the other people thought. He wanted to put his views forward, and he persuaded Congress to pass the Indian Removal Act of 1830, which forced them to be moved west of the Mississippi onto reservations. This led to a lot of things. This led to the Trail of Tears, which is what the Cherokee called their forced westwards march. The majority of Cherokee decided to stay where they were because they didn't want to move west, even though the settlers were telling them to. However, in spring 1838, 7,000 US Army soldiers forced them to move 1,000 miles to the new land, and on this journey, over 4,000 Indians died. So next, let's look at Seminole resistance. So after the Removal Act passed, a small group of Seminoles signed a treaty and went to the reservation. However, many local chiefs rejected the treaty, and they could do this because of how their sort of government sort of thing was set out. They had loads of different chiefs. Some would agree, some would disagree. Those who disagreed decided to reject it, and they ended up fighting 2 wars. The Second War was from 1835 to 1842. And after the Second War, the US accepted defeat, which they don't normally do. They offered to negotiate with the war chief, OCR, but instead of negotiating properly, they actually just imprisoned him and caused a third war. And then after the Third War, there were only 200 Seminoles left in Florida, and they were paid to move. So you can see this strategy. It took them a long time to figure it out, but they didn't care what they had to go through to get rid of them. They would lie. They would accept defeat. They don't care. They just wanted to get rid of them at all costs, really. So next, let's look at the final bit on America's expansion, the expansion of slavery. Slavery was legalized in 1641 across all of the American colonies, and Africans were brought to them by slave ships, and then they were forced to live as slaves. They were forced to work, they were unpaid, they had no rights, and they were whipped. More things about slaves. The US economy was reliant on slavery because the growing textile industry in England led to a huge cotton demand. So everyone around the world wanted cotton, and the US did this by slavery, and that was the only way they could do it, and their economy relied on it. And slave-picked cotton was the leading export from 1803. So that's why America's growth is often attributed to the bad things they did, because they earned a lot of money from this, which was one reason why the South didn't want to ban it. No slaves were allowed to be taken from other countries after 1808, because the other countries decided that it wasn't right. However, instead, slave owners traded within the US and made slaves breed more to get more slaves, and this led to the population of slaves increasing a lot, despite not getting them from other places. The cotton gin was a machine which could process 50 pounds of cotton a day, This means it would go at 50 times the speed of people, meaning that more pickers are needed to fill the machine with cotton to maximise the efficiency. So if we want this machine to work properly, we need 50 times the amount of people to put the stuff into it per day to get out the best we can through it. Also, the machine does the only skilled process, which would mean no training will be needed to be given to slaves, meaning there would be able to be a lot more of them and a lot less time would have to be spent on making them good at their jobs. Also, it made slavery more profitable, as you'd be able to make more money as you're processing more stuff, meaning you're shipping out more stuff and getting more money in from it. Despite all these bad things that happened, there was a slave revolt of 1811, which makes sense, they tried to fight back. Rebel slaves attacked plantation owners and inspired others to join them. And slave owners were compensated with $300 per slave killed. So every slave that got killed in the revolt, the person who owned the slave, so the person who treated them bad and led to them wanting to revolt, got paid $300. Stories of the harsh punishments spread fear, scaring many slaves because a lot of them were killed in very violent ways because of what they did, and it would warn other people against rebellion. So, sort of as a deterrent, they'd do really bad things to these people who rebelled. So yeah, that was expansion of slavery. That was a lot of stuff there. That's the second part. We'll do it another time. So thank you and goodbye.